Simon Badger, and today I'm here with Richard Austin. We're partners here at Treble Gordon, and we thought we'd just go through some of the basic parts of a shareholder agreement, when you might want to enter into one, why you would enter into a shareholder agreement, and some of the common things that you'll see within those sort of agreements. So, Richard, can you give us when would you typically enter into a shareholder agreement?
Ordinarily, Simon, we would recommend that everyone has a shareholder agreement in any company where there's any more than one shareholder. Whenever you have any more than two shareholders, you are really in effect in a partnership. And in a partnership, there's always the prospect of dispute, even though when you go into a venture, you're dead sure that you'll never have a dispute because you think you wouldn't go into it unless you were not going to have one. But we lawyers always tend to get asked to come to divorces rather than to weddings. So in that sense, a shareholder agreement is talking about what happens if there's a problem, what happens if we can't agree on something.
And it's particularly, I'm sure you agree, it's particularly important when there's an imbalance in terms of the shareholding. If for example, two shareholders, if you're not 50-50, it's really important that there are rules and structures in place to protect minority shareholders, particularly also where you've got two shareholders where perhaps one might be doing the day-to-day running of the business, whereas one's a bit more of a silent partner. They need to have sort of something to protect them.
Yeah, every company has a choice to have what's called a constitution, which is a set of registered rules, and a lot of the rules which are in a constitution are contained in the Companies Act. But those are public rules. Those are the rules which anyone who looks at the company's office register can tell what the rules of the company are. For example, how many directors have to vote on a matter? What are the rules around thresholds for there to be a majority? Is it 50%? Is it 75%? That's all public. But those rules do not deal with the issues that the two shareholders could have, particularly around if you have a problem, if you have an argument, or if you have, dare I say, a deadlock where you can't resolve how to do it. You don't want that washing to be advertised on the public register. So you have rules around that. It's quite common for companies to be 50-50, and you end up in a situation where you've got two people who can't agree on something and you need to break the deadlock. And to have a set of rules around that, and then Simon, you might talk about the various, if I use the word slang terms, which are the Mexican standoff way or the Russian roulette way of being able to trigger a resolution where two shareholders try to break the deadlock when they can't agree on something.
I think the key point though as to when is that it needs to be at the outset, or at least while you're still getting along and agreeing. Yep. As soon as there's any sort of inclination that there's going to be a dispute, it's too late. One of the reasons why you have these agreements in place is that having a predetermined set of procedures as to how you're going to deal with these things makes the process of going through a dispute infinitely easier and less expensive, because that's probably one of the big questions we get asked is, there is a cost involved to set up a shareholders agreement and going and seeing lawyers, but I think from our experience we can confidently say that the cost is far less to have one in place than to not.
Absolutely. And obviously a shareholder agreement in the coldest terms is there to sort out disputes, but it actually can also regulate operational stuff. For example, if you need more cash or you plan for there to be extra cash there to come into the venture, you can regulate that through commitments within the shareholder agreement. You can address what is your policy on declaring a dividend so that people can be comfortable that if the company is making profits, you will be able to get that out to fund your other initiatives. It can address also any issues of what are the things you need to have everybody agrees to. For example, a new shareholder coming in, a new purchase. Is it going to be a simple majority? Is it going to be a unanimous decision? So there are obviously two classes of key things we talk about within a shareholder agreement. How do you resolve a dispute? The timing, the process, and the value which could be attributed there to resolve it, as well as the operational stuff which goes with that.
And just picking up on your point on the operational stuff, I think a lot of people probably don't appreciate the distinction between the management of the company and the role of a shareholder, in that traditionally the role of a shareholder is quite passive and you don't do a lot. A shareholder agreement is a great opportunity for someone who is a shareholder and should be sort of passive in that nature to have the ability to have some exercise of control, even though they may not be a director or directly involved in the running of the company. As Richard said, it gives you an opportunity to put in place items where you have input and you are required to I guess give assent to various things.
It's a very good point. Under the Companies Act, the rights of the shareholder are pretty much restricted to attending the annual general meeting and asking questions, and to get a share of the dividend if one's asked. Apart from that,
and major transactions.
Exactly. Yeah. Where that is a major transaction is a transaction where the company is going to enter into a deal which has a value of more than 1/2 of the value of the company. And a lot of company work, of course, will fall well short of that threshold. So for a shareholder who is not particularly active in a business, a shareholder agreement is pretty important to give them a fair more degree of certainty around what they're putting their cash into.
Yeah. Should we just talk quickly about those the exit provisions which we've touched on previously? One of the key elements or key things that are usually looked at in a shareholder agreement is that what happens once you've got a fundamental dispute which can't be resolved. How does the company get dealt with, and what are the processes that are put in place for that?
Well, the first thing you should know is that the Companies Act has no easy process for shareholders to resolve their disputes. And ordinarily, a constitution will not have any easy processes for resolving a dispute. Essentially, people have to work it out. So, if there is a dispute, normally you would start with a dispute whereby somebody has to say, enough's enough, we need to trigger a process. And the only place you can find that process will be in your shareholder agreement.
Yep. And in terms of the most common ones that you would see?
Ordinarily, the person who calls for the dispute there to be they're determined has to take a risk that he might control the process going forward, or if he pulls the trigger, it might fall back in his face, in the sense that the other party could say, well, now you pulled the dispute, I'm taking you out. Most, though, would start with a mediation approach, which is get round the table and try to resolve it, but in the context of it being a regulated path. And if you don't resolve it at that, you might have some consequences which flow. What it does, it puts a Bunsen burner on the backside and makes people pay attention, because unless they resolve it, there might be bigger consequences, some of which they might not like.
And there's no one size fits all approach, is there?
No.
It really depends on the type of company and the shareholders who you're dealing with.
And particularly what roles each person actually plays in the company. And it's not unusual in a two-party company. One is the operative person, the one who's the specialist in the game. If it's a sales company, they're the guys who are going out actually and who are making it happen. In the background is the other shareholder who's got the money, who might have no skills within sales. So how do you resolve that? So the deadlock breaking process might not be appropriate. It might be just a simple pull the trigger and one person has to buy the other out in accordance with a valuation process. There is no cookie cutter answer here. Every situation is different, and when you work through what you need in a shareholder agreement, you confront those things. And if you do it at the front end of a business deal, the parties are talking and they can pay attention and understand the dynamic the other party has to deal with. It's easier to come to the wedding than it is to come to the divorce.